Hello and welcome to the Alectio tutorial on designing your own querying strategy for an active learning experiment on our platform. My name is Justin. I will be walking you through that process today. So if you have not seen our prior tutorial on just the basics and the rudiments of experiment creation, I'd recommend you check that one out first. Some of the screens that you'll see here, I go into a little more detail during that video, so we may breeze past a couple of those things now. So if anything looks confusing, just go back and check that one out. But the main thing I want to again refresh before we start, the goal of these tutorials is to look at the most common use cases on our platform. In this case, a customer who has a large data set that's looking to optimize that data set to their model to find the most optimal data to train that model on. As mentioned in the previous tutorial, you can only run experiments on private data, not public data. So here we will do this private data, which is actually experiment tutorials. Something I can also mention is that when you have a lot of experiments, you can click this little star and you'll see a different stars tab. So we might as well just start from there. So obviously just hover over that tile, click go to workspace, and we will get started. Fairly self-explanatory screen here. So we are just going to create our new experiment and get up and running. Similar to the last one, it's just a really simple three-step process to kind of just make the experiment itself. So we'll just call this curation experiment number 1. Here you'll see that we have 3 main types of experiments. We have a data diagnostics, data filtering, and active learning experiments. We are doing active learning today. The data diagnostics and data filtering experiments will be coming in a future tutorial. But once you click this active learning tile here, the next button will light up, so we will go down to the next page. Our prior tutorial, if you will remember, was on our machine learning driven active learning solution. Those are our own kind of ensemble method of choosing what data you're going to train in your next loop. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to design our own querying strategy, and we are also going to manually curate our data. I'm going to choose manually curate the data first, but we are going to cover both. So this is something you might want to do if you were, you just had specific data you wanted to start or train your model on in each successive loop. It's great for experimenting, kind of coming up with just sort of getting yourself familiar with how active learning works. We see some students using this. It's a pretty cool feature. I like it a lot. So obviously, once you click there, you'll see the next button. You're going to see a simple kind of experiment criteria page. You'll see this every time you create experiments on Alectio. You choose how many loops you would like to do. You can choose how many, you can define a limit per loop, either how much time it takes, how much it costs, or how many records. We'll just stick with records since that's a fairly common one. You can use a different number of records for the first loop. The first loop will always be random in an active learning experiment. That's something that's super important. So no matter what, not in this case, obviously, because we're going to manually curate our data, but for ones where you create a strategy, the first loop, because active learning relies on kind of how the model's behaved after it trains first, when there's nothing to train it on, it's just going to randomly select. So that's why you kind of have this option here that there's a different number of records for the first loop. But we're just going to say the same one. That's typical behavior. We click next. Real simple preview experiment details page. There's our name, there's our strategy, there's our loops, there's our records. Very simple. Here, say you were just setting this up for tomorrow. You could create this experiment and start it later. We are not going to wait, though. We are just going to jump right in and click start. So the next thing you'll see is an actual kind of a grid of, this is the Cocoa data set. This is a grid of just images that you want to try training your first loop on. Again, 20 is probably a little low if you're running a real experiment. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to stick with 20. It works the way you'd expect it to. You simply just click on the images that you'd like to run on your first loop. So we'll click these nice little bears, tennis guy, very old cell phone. I don't know what kind of food this is, but we'll click that. And you can see as you click, it lets you know how many you've selected and how many you have left to select. You could at some point just say, hey, I've chosen maybe just a bunch of buffalo here. You've chosen all the buffalo that you can find. That's how you want to start training your model. You can then click this randomly select remaining. So we're going to do that now. You can see down here, this guy got selected. It's this dude, I think he's on the phone, got selected. And then you can, of course, clear all your selections there if you want to start over. So we'll just kind of do the random selections, and it's as simple as that. You click Start to Trade, and you can see we're up and running. Future tutorials will kind of show you what loops 2, 3 look like, what the reports are, et cetera, but we just kind of want to get you started right now in this tutorial. But that was manual curation. So now we're going to actually do something that's probably more typical behavior, which is designing your own querying strategy. In active learning, you can basically, again, after that first loop will be random, but each successive loop, you can choose what sort of data, like what your criteria is for selecting the next data for the next loop. The most typical thing that, a lot of people think of active learning querying strategies is least confident. So what is the model least confidently predicting after its first loop? We want to train it on that. That's actually not always the best solution. It's actually kind of a rudimentary one, and one of the reasons we at Alectio think a lot of people are actually sleeping on active learning as a kind of really revolutionary approach to machine learning generally. But that is a querying strategy, right? There's a lot of different querying strategies, and you'll see those as we go through, but I just wanted to kind of set the table before we jumped in. So let's, again, create a new experiment. We're going to just call this curation experiment 2. Again, this is active learning. We're going to click that. Going to kind of go through this pretty quick because we've already seen all this stuff. So we're going to say next. Again, we went through the manually curate data experience already. So now we're going to design our own querying strategy. Click that guy. Click next. For the sake of consistency, we will again just do 10 loops, and we will again just define the limit as 20 records. We know these are a little on the low side, but that's okay. It's a tutorial, right? Yet again, met with the preview experiment details page. You can create experiment and start later, but we are going to be impatient in this tutorial and click start. Here's where you'll notice there is a difference. As mentioned, the first loop will be random. Not much to do in this particular experience with the first loop. But after the first loop, you can obviously just randomly select records, not usually what we see, but something you could do. But here you can select records based on certain kinds of uncertainty, right? You can do confidence level, you can do margin, you can do entropy. After the first loop, you can do some cool advanced stuff. You can choose lowest entropy, highest entropy, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see a nice little graph here in future ones where it sort of shows you how things are behaving. You can select by rank or by range. Again, certain things are not available until the first loop, as we mentioned in the last one, but just kind of wanted to just show you sort of just the breadth of options you have to choose the data for each specific loop. And in fact, that brings us to this point. You can actually change your querying strategy as your experiment goes on. You could do that for one experiment and keep the same querying strategy for a different experiment. There's a reason we call these experiments. We want you to play around. We think that there are, real benefits in trying different things with active learning. We found internally that different kinds of querying strategies are successful for different sorts of use cases. Without belaboring the point, they're just sticking with lowest confidence does not always tend to work out well. So we really suggest that you kind of dig in and play around and really kind of find out what querying strategy your model prefers with the data that you have. But again, once you kind of choose those things, it is fairly simple. You could obviously say you want to pause at each loop to change your strategy, make amendments, whatever. Or we're going to use the same one the entire time. Then we again click start to train, and that's it. Future tutorials we go through will kind of look into the reports and how things look on each successive loop. But what we wanted to highlight in this one is that, that you can either let us decide how we are going to sample that data as you train through successive loops on the platform, or you can get kind of down in the weeds, even to a granular level of selecting each individual data point for each successive loop, or again, more typically, a kind of overarching strategy either per loop or for the entire experiment itself. And that is it for this tutorial. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you again soon.